but that whatever is going on there, it's given us this sense that something was happening, even post Good Friday and maybe pre-Easter, at least part of Easter that we know, which is the empty tomb, that something's going on there. And it's a difficult passage, I'm not going to lie, but I think that's one of the unique contributions, is that something happened when Jesus rose from the dead that wasn't as obvious that we read about at the end of the Gospels. The obvious thing of meaning he physically appeared and met with the disciples. There's something actually else going on in a world unseen to us. So Peter makes a contribution there that's really unique.
Well, Dr. Edwards, thank you so much, sir, for joining us on Faith in the Folds. It is a pleasure to have you.
Well, Kevin, really is good to be with you. And thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Sure thing. I was glad that I had made acquaintance with Nijay Gupta, a friend of yours, because I was hunting for somebody to help us with First Peter. And when I saw him post a picture of you on Facebook, and he had mentioned your work on First Peter, I thought, oh man, okay, this is the guy. I want to get to Dr. Edwards. Before we started recording, apparently has this great nickname. I don't know if you want to talk about Dr. Dre and how that works for you.
Well, my initials are DRE. My middle name is Robert, Dennis Robert Edwards, and I'm a Reverend and I'm a doctor. So Rev Dr. Dre has been my handle for several years now.
I see. I like how that differentiates you from someone else who might also go by Dr. Dre, Reverend Dr. Dre.
Exactly.
That brings a real pious ring to it. I like that.
Thanks. And Nijay, I got to hire him as my publicist or something. He's been saying some really nice things about my written work, and he keeps encouraging me. So I'm glad that he's part of this connection.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, we'll be sure to tag him in when this goes out, and I'll let y'all work out the details of how exactly you're going to hire him. Maybe you've got a budget there at North Park to hire him for that.
It'll just have to be a lunch every now and then or something.
That's right. Yeah. I'll buy breakfast at SBL. Yeah. Well, Dr. Edwards, I'm excited to meet you, and really looking forward to our conversation on First Peter. To help us get to know you a little bit, though, can you tell us, how long have you been teaching? What got you into teaching? Where do you teach? And eventually, sort of what piqued your interest in First Peter?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to share that. I teach at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago. I'm in my third year there, associate professor of New Testament. But I've been teaching since about 2000, so for about 21 years now. But I finished my doctoral studies at the Catholic University of America. I studied largely under the late Joseph Fitzmyer, a New Testament giant, and finished in 2003, I think it was. Yeah. So for about, but I started teaching before I was done. Anyway, I taught mostly adjunct, though, because I had been a pastor, and at that time was serving a church in Washington, D.C. And then eventually I became a pastor in Minnesota. So I taught at Bethel Theological Seminary for a while. And then I moved a short time at Northern Seminary and now at North Park. So yeah, I've been teaching for a long time, teaching New Testament, biblical Greek exegesis, courses like that.
Very cool.
Oh, now you mentioned First Peter, my interest. I did my dissertation work in James. And when I was getting into James, this is a while ago now, that language of the diaspora and that comes up at the beginning of James is also in First Peter. And those are the two main places. It shows up one other time in the Gospel of John, but there's debate over how literally we should understand the term in James and also in First Peter. So I wound up paying attention to both of those books when I was doing my dissertation work. And also had done some work in it way back in seminary days, our exegesis class spent time in First Peter. So I'd always been intrigued with First Peter,
Yeah.
had preached in First Peter as a pastor. And then when I was asked to do the commentary for the Story of God Bible commentary series, I was like, oh, this is exciting. I get to go into that book that I had already had been interested in and had been reading alongside James. So that's kind of where my interest started way back.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny that you mentioned how you did, exegetical work in First Peter back in seminary. I went to a small seminary affiliated with my church tradition in Memphis, Tennessee, and one of our New Testament professors always taught the advanced Greek exegesis class in First Peter.
Oh, wow.
And so like that's a great crash course into Greek and exegesis and just all the different things that you can get into with that. Yeah,
I agree. And I think the next time I teach Greek exegesis, I'm going to use First Peter, because for that very reason, I've been working in different books for the class, and but since I'm going to continue to do some scholarly work in First Peter, I thought, oh, it might be fun to have my class go along with me in doing some translation and dealing with grammar issues and so forth. So I'm glad you got exposed to it. I mean, it is rich, and it's good Greek, which prompts some people to wonder if Peter wrote it or not. I mean, that comes up sometimes too, but it's a good book to get into.
Sure. If you don't mind, at some point later, when it's relevant, let's dig into why maybe some people think, or actually, would you mind being able to do that now? We can start with
now.
there.
Yeah, we can talk a lot about First Peter, but I think authorship is one of those things that comes up, almost with every New Testament book.
Sure.
Especially ones that don't have a name on them, right? But this one does, and so does Second Peter. But both of those books have gotten a lot of scholarly interest. Sticking to First Peter for now, one of the issues is that use of Greek. I mean, there's a heavy reliance on the Septuagint, a lot of quotes from the Old Testament, and then there's just the styling, the relative sophistication of the Greek, that some have said, hey, that's not a Galilean fisherman, who wrote this. So that's been one of the knocks. As I listen to and read, but also get a chance to listen to some scholars, many of them, there's a division still, but I would say there's a good number that defend Peter as an author. I think one creative solution has come from Gene Green. He has a book called Vox Petri, The Voice of Peter. And his argument is that we might think of a Petrine circle. We might think of people connected to Peter. And for First Peter, certainly he could have been, alive when it was done, but his voice carries on even into Second Peter. So I would say there's good argument that Peter wrote the book. I mean, it's not a slam dunk, but I would say there's stronger argument for Peter having written it than not.
Yeah. Fascinating that you mentioned this book by Gene Green, because at the time of recording, the last episode that I released in the series is with this professor that I was mentioning. His name is Dr. Alan Black, just recently retired from Harding School of Theology in Memphis. He and I did our episode on the Gospel of Mark. And he mentions this book by Gene Green.
Yes.
And so it's just kind of fascinating that.
Oh, I'm glad for the connection.
It'll be neat to kind of bookend this series, more or less, with a mention of this book, Vox Petri, there in the Gospel of Mark. And then whenever this episode releases, probably sometime early 2022.
Okay.
It'll be it'll get a shout out again. Maybe this is a sign from the Lord that I need to pick up this book and take a look at it.
And get Gene Green if you can. It's a big book though. I mean, but he does some really, I mean, it's a really deep but thoughtful engagement with the legacy of Peter. I mean, the history of Peter that we know from the apostles, the historic Peter, right? And how he's presented in the apostles. I mean, and the Gospels, I mean, and then also the legacy of the writings that bear his name. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. So to recap for the sake of the audience who might not be as familiar or who might just kind of be reeling for a second, think, well, what do you mean? There's debate, right? That's what my Bible says, right? This is Peter. One reason that a lot of folks a lot of New Testament scholars have had some concerns with readily affirming Peter's authorship of this book is because as a Galilean fisherman, to these particular scholars, it seems unlikely that somebody like Peter, a Galilean fisherman, could write with this degree of sophistication that we see in the letter of First Peter, not only with the quality of Greek, but also just the interpretive and rhetorical sophistication and using quotes from the Old Testament and crafting an argument and things like that. Is that a fair, succinct summary of the issues that a lot of scholars have?
That's one of the main ones. I would say, another is related to the so-called household codes, where Peter addresses enslaved people and women in chapter 2 going into chapter 3, which is something we see in Colossians and Ephesians. And there's scholarly argument over those two books having been written later than the life of Paul. And since they were martyred around the same time, there's an argument that Peter could have, First Peter was written later also, so those kinds of scholarly discussions, I talk to my students about it. It's not the kind of stuff we talk about in church very much, but they are academic arguments because we can't prove it. And you're right, their names are on the book, but because there have been ancient practices of people putting names of people on books that they didn't write, some have argued, well, maybe that happened with New Testament books as well, even though we can't prove that. I would say the argument, though, is strong that Peter wrote. And as far as the grammar and such, I'll just say briefly, I'm forgetting the scholar's name right now, but there's an argument that, the tradespeople would have actually been pretty good at Koine Greek because they had to be. So people like fishermen would have been good at Koine Greek, even though Peter was a Semite and would have functioned in Aramaic. He could have functioned very well in Greek because he had to do business using Greek. So there's that theory, at least a theory that helps to counter his.
It's historically plausible that
exactly.
tradesmen of Peter's time would have been at least bilingual.
Exactly, and pretty good at it. Exactly.
One thing that I find particularly helpful in this discussion is some of the work by Randy Richards, or his. You normally find his publication name E. Randolph Richards. Does a lot of work with the secretaries in the letters of Paul. And I've thought for a while now that it would make sense, at least there in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 12, when he says that through Silvanus I have written this letter. I know some people will argue that is Peter's way of saying, hey, that here is the guy. Here's basically my Tertius, tip of the hat to Romans 16:22.
Exactly.
And I, for me, find that argument compelling. You may not find it as compelling, but I think it at least makes sense to me.
Well, I think that goes back to Dr. Gene Green's book on the Vox Petri and the Petrine circle, that let's say that circle includes the people who actually are doing the writing while Peter's doing the thinking and the presentation and the, and initiating the discussion. I honestly don't know how those dynamics worked. I mean, the old way when we were kids, or at least me, I'm old now, you had this sense of some writer in a trance getting, Lord whispering in his ear and then moving his hand to write or something, magical. But the idea of the apostles talking their ideas out and saying what they want to say and having somebody else write it down with their style, I think that's a very plausible and realistic scenario. So yes, I think the idea of a scribe or a secretary, or the fancy term amanuensis, I think that's a real good possibility with First Peter, as well as you mentioned, Pauline writings.
Yeah. Well, cool. I wasn't expecting to get into all that, but I love that kind of stuff. It's fascinating, and I think that we were able to present it in a way that was fairly easy to follow, especially for folks who have been kind enough to kind of walk through this podcast series for a while. I mentioned these issues. I had this kind of conversation, I think, with Lynn Cohick on Ephesians.
Oh, excellent.
And I think maybe a couple of other folks that I've talked to about some different things. And so, I'm glad we're able to dig into this. We've mentioned we've mentioned First Peter. We've kind of touched on some of these technical issues with First Peter. Help us understand what is the literary type of
Hmm.
First Peter, and
Hmm.
based on that,
Yeah.
what does that tell us about how the original audience would have
Right.
understood Peter? How does that help us understand maybe what the letter is
Yeah.
trying to do? Or I say letter, maybe I'm jumping the gun there.
Well, I mean, I'm glad that you said no. I think it's pretty clear it's a letter, and it fits the stereotypical pattern of a letter that we know from the Greco-Roman world. There's an opening, there's a the greeting, there's a Thanksgiving,
Mhm.
and then at the end we see the wrap up and the salutations. Very clear structure of, unlike say Hebrews or First John, where
Yeah.
we package them like they're letters. We stick them in that part of the Bible, and
Mhm.
we refer to them as letters, but there's very little about them, especially First John, that has a literary tone. I kind of laugh at First John because he launches in with what was from the beginning, and then he ends with this mic drop: "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." Boom! Like what, and so it's not so First Peter's not nearly that stark, right?
Right. Yeah.
He opens up, and it really is a letter. But what letters tell us is that there's a community there, right? And
Mhm.
the community is dealing with something. And I sometimes in my classes want to make that really clear to students, is that we've got communication happening. It's not just some edict that dropped out the sky, but there's real people here, hearing from their apostle. And so so when somebody is writing the letter, Paul, Peter, maybe John, they are addressing something that's alive
Mhm.
in the congregation. Whether it's some kind of controversy like the division of First Corinthians, and you got Paul saying, "Look, I hear there's divisions among you," and he wants to help them heal. Or there's Peter dealing with a variety of issues that these believers are facing. You mentioned that it's a letter, and I think in addition to acknowledging it's a letter, I want to acknowledge that it's a letter sent to multiple Christians, right? They're
Mhm.
scattered around this area of what would be modern day Turkey. So he names these provinces because there's pockets of believers around there that he's writing. So you could think of it almost like an encyclical, that it's meant to be read and shared
Yeah.
among these Christians in Turkey.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes perfect sense. And one thing that I've really enjoyed, as I read about letter collections, um, it- whether it's letter collections of New Testament authors or just sort of general Greco-Roman letter collections, it seems likely that as these congregations in these different cities would have read this, chances are they might have been making copies of that letter to
Right.
have for themselves.
That's
I mean, this
right.
is this is
That's
a this
right.
is a word from Peter the apostle, the guy who walked with Jesus.
That's
I
right.
mean, he was there for so much of it. We need to hang
Yes.
on to this. Is
Yeah,
that
I agree.
plausible historically?
Oh, very much so. Our friend Craig Evans, who's done a lot of work in the in New Testament manuscripts, and
Guy's done a lot of work in everything.
he's been around for a while. And he's done some awesome work,
Yeah.
but he does address the idea of manuscripts, because we used to think of it as a continuous line, like when the thing is about to die out, then you write a copy, and
Right. Yeah.
then it, and so we think of, but really the original letter could have been around for quite a while, even as the copies are being made. So
Mhm.
it's not, we don't have to think in terms of these discrete time periods, but overlapping time periods. So it's very much the case that letters got copied that way, and then got shared around the what was then the empire. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So as a letter being passed around to these different cities
Yeah.
in modern day country of Turkey,
Right.
when they would have gotten this letter, what next? How would they have read this? What would have been the expectation for them to do after getting this
Yeah.
letter and reading it to everybody there
Oh,
in the house?
that's a great pastoral question, because I think that's gets at the whole point of the letters. They're really pastoral
Mhm.
communications in many ways, right? So you have the letter bearer coming, and somebody designated to read it, probably the person who carried it. In this case Sylvanus, maybe, or whomever
Mhm.
is bringing this letter. You've got well, the letter carrier is going to be reading this letter. the reason why I think this is such an important area that I hadn't actually thought about for until recent years is how much that letter carrier reader um, is expected in person to help to communicate what's going on. Our friend Scott McKnight has written on this with relation to Phoebe
Yeah.
in Romans,
Mhm.
that as she's reading the letter, she would know what Paul wants to get across. So you can, in inflection and emphasis, and even in your eye contact, help the community understand what the author's trying to say. But so what happens is the letter gets read, probably gets
Mhm.
read all at one time, right? And people are hearing and being encouraged, being challenged, and all the emotions that go with it, to be what they're supposed to be. And in this case, I think Peter is really offering a word of encouragement, because the community seems to be suffering
Yeah.
and they seem to be facing real serious challenges because of their faith.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Phoebe there in Romans chapter 16. I, I think I can't remember if he and I mentioned this, but I interviewed Rafael Rodriguez on Romans. Rafi and I have run into each other a couple of times. There's a small conference called the Stone Campbell Journal Conference that often meets at Johnson University there in Knoxville, Tennessee,
Oh, okay.
and more or less denominationally affiliated with our with the big umbrella that our church traditions came from. And he was very gracious to let me interview him on Romans. And I can't remember if we mentioned this, but it is, and I think it is at least historically sensible. I mean, it makes a lot of sense for somebody like Phoebe there, who gets introduced kind of out of nowhere, right?
Right,
Paul
right.
ramps up this great discussion about strong in the week after talking about all this great stuff about transformation and everything else. And then it gets to, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who's a diakonos, right? You know, she's
Yeah.
a servant, a minister, a deacon, however,
Right, right.
however you parse that out. She obviously has a pretty important role to play here. And historically, it makes sense for her to be the one to present this. And I like how you gave little details there too, like she would have inflection and nuance and things like that.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
somebody's bringing this letter, like how Phoebe would have brought Romans. Somebody is
Right,
bringing this letter around to
right,
these churches in Turkey here for First
right.
Peter.
Exactly.
Getting into the actual letter itself,
Hmm.
what are some of the major emphases that we see here? I
Yeah.
think you mentioned persecution a
Yeah,
minute
I
ago.
use,
Do you want to start
yes,
there?
yes, I use the word suffering.
Mhm.
I hesitate a little bit to say persecution because it's hard to know like how uh, uniform and consistent
Sure.
the oppression
Yeah.
was. Um, and some would argue that it's not yet a state sponsored um, oppression of Christians,
Okay.
or suppression. We know that's going to happen because we have records of in the early second century with that conversation between Pliny and Trajan. They have
Yeah.
letters going back and forth, and it's
In a
this
geographical area that's
this very area.
that
Yep,
this very
Bithynia,
area. Yeah.
Galatia, this
Mhm.
very area. So we know it's coming.
Mhm.
So what we think is happening is the sort of the forerunner to that real hot oppression is the marginalization that's happening. So I call it suffering because Peter doesn't he's not explicit about so much physical pain or even being arrested. He does use the word make your defense, but it's not clear if it's but the way he describes the oppression are things like slander and kind of that blasphemy, the way that they kind of talk about you and marginalize you. So the suffering might not yet be random acts of violence,
Mhm.
but it does include a way that's shutting out people, Christian people, from the mainstream of society. They're taking abuse, is the way Peter puts it, and abuse is often verbal. You
Yeah.
know, so that's one of the themes. And in
Mhm.
fact, I'll say what real clearly we'll see it at the beginning and at the end. At the beginning in chapter 1, he says you're going through these fiery ordeals. He
Yeah.
doesn't spell them out, but he calls them fiery trials. And then at the end, close to the end, chapter 4, he talks about suffering, being called a Christian, which we think was an insult. But he says, look, don't take any shame in that. You're honored before God, even though you're being dishonored in the society.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned particularly some of the ways in which Christians could be shut out of kind of mainstream society. What are some, help us flesh that out a little bit, if you don't mind. What are
Yeah.
some details? What are some specific ways that Christians
Mhm.
could have been shut out?
Yeah, I mean that's a fair question. There's in chapter 4 he says you
Yeah, and
spent the
if we need to pull out Bibles and take a look at this,
oh yeah,
I'm
yeah,
perfectly
I'm
fine with reading the Bible on the podcast.
that's good. Well, I'm going to make a reference to something that is maybe it's not shut out in an obvious sense, but he says in verse 3 of chapter 4, for you spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do. This is the NIV
Mhm.
translation. Living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless wild living, and they heap abuse on you. One aspect is to say, some of those words, of course, are really horrible kind of things when you think about, just how people should act.
Yeah.
But if you think about some of those, like the general carousing kind of
Mhm.
notion, or even drunkenness, that there were these social gatherings, a bacchanal, if you will, named for Bacchus, right? They
Yeah.
had these parties that if you are a Gentile and you have to make your way in society, right? And maybe we think of it like now, a competitive society is built on the relations that you make, the connection,
Mhm.
the social connections you make. So if you're going to these parties and making social connections, but now you as a Christian, you're like, oh my goodness, I can't participate in that. So you don't go to those parties. Well, now you've lost social connection. So you're not able to get the deal that you need to get made, or you're not able to buy that plot of land that you thought you were going to buy. You're gonna have some difficulty maneuvering there, and not just the difficulty maneuvering, but now they heap abuse on you. They're going to shame you
Yeah.
for being a Christian. So that marginalization could be business. That marginalization could be how you live, who you're going to be dealing with in the marketplace. I mean, all those things conspire, right, to put you in a different place out of mainstream society.
Yeah. Yeah. Some scary stuff too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And hence, perhaps maybe a good segue into another theme of that we see in First Peter. Is there anything in First Peter where he urges them to remain united, or something along those lines,
Yeah.
against these kinds of abuses?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because I actually even wrote as a thought. I phrased it this way for myself as I thought about these themes in there. I called it community solidarity. That there's
Mhm.
this that Peter picks up on the imagery of the way God's people are described in the Old Testament, Jewish people, and he uses that imagery, like in chapter 2, that you are this royal priesthood, this holy nation. You're God's special people. He's giving them an alternate identity that's
Mhm.
consistent with the identity of God's people in the Old Testament. But if there are Gentile converts here, he's just now grafted them in
Mhm.
to the people of God, and giving them an identity when they were losing an identity in their society, and then creating community solidarity, because he uses the words of loving each other, of being sympathetic to one another. I mean, there's a lot of community building kind of language that goes through here. So yes, the way to fight, if you will, fight the tensions from the broader society, is to build strong relationship with each other. I think that's a message that comes through. I think there's a public witness message that comes through also in chapter
Yeah.
3. He says, look, you have to be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have, but you do it with respect.
Mhm.
He also talks about the public witness in terms of not undermining even the Roman authorities by looking suspect, so you behave yourself, if you will.
Yeah.
You honor the emperor, give respect to these people. You love God, you love the sisters and brothers, you got a community of love, but you give respect and honor to the secular rulers. He's not blessing them and saying they're all doing the right thing.
Sure.
He's
Yeah.
trying to say to your folks, this is how you um, have a safe kind of lower profile, if you will, because since you're taking the abuse, one of the things that, and this has happened to all marginalized people in every society, marginalized people wound up being very careful with the authorities, because they know the authorities can give them grief and make their life even more complicated. So they tend to be rather deferential to the people who are in authority so as not to make their lives more complicated. I
Yeah.
think that message comes through as well.
Yeah. And understood. And similar conversations that I've had with other folks about marginalized people, they have indicated similar things. Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's exactly how the early Christians would have found themselves.
that's right.
I recognize that it is still, especially where I have lived. Okay. So I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, went to a private Christian university in Arkansas, went to seminary in Memphis, Tennessee, and then lived in central Kentucky and now live in Corpus Christi, Texas. All right.
Wow.
Those are all places that still have a predominant cultural acceptance of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is easy for me to be a Christian. I say easy, okay, here are the air quotes around that, but it's easy for me to be a Christian in places like that. That's where I tell somebody, yeah, I'm a pastor at a church, or I'm working on a doctorate in biblical studies. Before I graduated last year, generally speaking, people, they were either neutral or they respected that.
Mm.
And I have not lived anywhere where people immediately think, whoa, what are you, like, you some kind of like snake oil salesman or something like that? And so in some ways it's hard for me to understand this text as it is written to people who find themselves on the outside.
Yeah, and I hear that. And I think in a couple of ways. There's the possibility that Christianity, especially in light of our politicized culture, that whatever a genuine faith in Jesus ought to look like, and I have opinions about that, but could actually start to feel and appear to be unaccepted by the larger society. And I think some would argue that's happening already.
Yeah.
So what Peter has to say, is very real, or becoming even more real for us. I would say also, though, that people have been marginalized for other reasons. Also, I mean, because of race or gender or immigration status, that there's that Peter is giving us a message that those marginalized people are exemplars for us of how we can live our faith when our faith comes into question. I say that because not only is he writing to this large community, he zeroes in on enslaved people in chapter 2 and on women. So we're talking about the marginal of the marginalized, right?
Yeah.
So within the community, enslaved people really have no rights, and then women have limited rights. But he addresses them both groups. And even though one might say that he's not giving them like a real manifesto for liberation, he is giving them some words that when they follow the way of Jesus to keep themselves safe in their society and keep themselves from taking more abuse, they actually show the way of Christ to a greater extent or in a better way than people who are in the mainstream of society. In other words, marginalized people of faith are the best exemplars of the faith.
Yeah, because that's how Christ found himself in the world.
Exactly. And that's the way Peter was saying, because that's the way Jesus was. He'll say this is particularly in chapter 2, toward the end of chapter 2. He says, because when you're this way, that's the way Jesus was, who suffered, he took abuse, and he didn't retaliate. Yeah. So it's not a way of saying, look, just take every hit that comes to you in society and, just grin and bear it. He's saying, no, there's a way of being like Christ that when these things do come, the way you respond is a witness of what Christ is like.
Yeah. I'm glad I'm glad we're going this route, because this is something that I have been wrestling with for, man, I can't remember I was first made aware of this, but let's say 2, 3, 4 years ago, sometime around there, I was finally made aware that, all right, if I am, and culturally, ethnically, racially, if I'm a member of what we tend to call majority culture, I'm prompted to, or maybe I'm led to, or maybe experience leads me to often see things differently than how others might see things. I'm a
Sure.
white male Christian.
Mhm.
My wife, a white female Christian, would see things differently.
Right.
Friends that I've interviewed on the podcast here, African American male, Caribbean male.
Mhm.
So those two guys have experienced race in the U.S.
Mhm.
very differently.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one thing that I've found is that when I look at, say, what Jesus was doing, his situation is kind of different from mine. I find myself in ethnic and cultural majority.
Mhm.
Jesus found himself where he was in Judea and Galilee. Sure, ethnic majority, right? Yeah, majority of folks there would be Jewish,
Right.
but definitely in terms of power structures, in the minority or in the marginalized, in the less powerful.
Sure. Mhm.
And then these folks that we see here, Peter addressing, they're on the minority in the minority in terms
That's right.
of
That's right.
religion, perhaps ethnicity, if they have some Jewish background,
Mhm.
in terms of power structures. And so there's all these little shades here and there that I'm gradually becoming sensitive to read through this and think, okay,
Yeah.
all right, Lord, lead me to how I can faithfully apply and live out what you've mentioned here
Yeah.
in ways that I see operating here in Scripture.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate your sensitivity there because I feel, I mean, scholars refer to what you just described as social location, that it's our social location that we actually bring to, well, to everything, including
Mhm.
our reading of the Bible.
Yeah,
And I know that for some people it's hard to think that way. They say, look, everybody should just come to the same conclusions or ask the same questions, but we really don't. I mean, so when I'm reading this and I'm reading a passage in First Peter addressed to, household slaves, I can't help but to think of the legacy of my own people in this country,
sure.
right? So I don't read that from a power position. I'm reading that from the position of folks that have been marginalized. So for example, I think of, you said we might look at things differently or look at situations differently. I look at, say, even the police differently. I get nervous when I see police
Mhm.
where white folks might get excited and say, oh, good, there's safety here. I get a little nervous. So I think like when Peter says to the enslaved people in chapter 2, and he says in verse 19 that you might be suffering unjustly. He acknowledges that it's unjust, but he still encourages them not to retaliate, but to
Yeah,
be like Jesus. So for me, that's like, young people, we tell them to keep their hands on the wheel when the police come, because we don't want this to escalate for no good reason.
yeah.
And even though we don't have control, it could still be unjust,
Mhm.
but you do what you can to keep the situation, or to keep yourself clean of any
Sure.
wrongdoing. So I think that's coming through in the letter as well. It's like to keep your reputation right, even if the society is not right. This is how you behave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is. I know my audience, and I know that it may be difficult for some of us to hear
Mm.
what
Yeah.
you have just said. I
Yeah.
have known enough friends whom I respect, who have
Yeah.
had to tell me that they've experienced that, or
Yeah.
have told me that they tell their kids, okay, when you're driving, here's what they goes. And even though it's outside my experience,
Yeah.
I am led to trust that they're not all crazy
Yeah. Yeah.
and they're not all making up this kinds of things.
Yeah.
As we go through this section here, right there near the end of
Mm-hmm.
chapter 2, beginning of chapter
Mm-hmm.
3,
Mm-hmm.
Peter is talking to these folks. He then
Mm-hmm.
kind of switches gears
Mm-hmm.
and addresses at the most basic, in terms of the social location, kind of what this phrase,
Mm-hmm.
this helpful phrase that you
Right.
just mentioned. In
Yeah.
terms of social location, at the most basic unit of society, Peter turns and addresses husbands,
Mm-hmm.
not a group that often received a lot of family instruction in ancient Greek,
Right.
uh, in ancient Greek
Mm-hmm.
instructions about how a successful house was carried on. Usually, those
Right.
instructions were given for enslaved persons,
Mm-hmm.
for children,
That's
and
right.
for wives.
That's right.
And Peter does something very strange here and says, "Oh, hey, husbands, don't fall asleep on me. Can I
Yeah.
ask, what do you make of the fact that Peter goes from kind of the most marginalized with enslaved persons
Yeah.
to less marginalized, wives, to then bam, suddenly we're at the head of the household.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
What is Peter trying to do here?
I think that, I mean, that's good. I think there is you mentioned our friend Lynn Cohick in Ephesians, and she would probably have a lot more to say about the household codes because they are more extensive in Ephesians and Colossians. But the same point exists that you're right. We don't expect the power person to be addressed the way we expect the powerless to be addressed. That is what makes these household codes more Christian. I should say the Christians didn't create the household codes. They,
Sure.
the society inherited them, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Aristotle and people earlier on said this is the way society should be arranged. So it is something noteworthy, and I'm glad you went there to say, hey, let's talk to the power person in the household and say what should happen. And even when he says in the same way, verse 7 copies verse 3, sorry, chapter 3, verse 1, the same way, submit to your husbands. And then he had already said in chapter 2, using the language of submission, the idea that if we want to model the way of Jesus, then these husbands need to recognize that their wives are partners, which I think is already very different from the
Mhm.
way the rest of society would have operated. So I'm glad you mentioned that. It's an important part to say. We tend to think, oh, he's just trying to keep women in their place. But no, the idea is women are witnesses, especially if their husbands are not believers. And here we've got these husbands who need to understand that they can't play the power game in their household. Their wives are fellow heirs, joint
Yeah.
heirs of the promises. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. And especially mentioning that word heirs,
Mm-hmm.
and you get into, again, some issues that if we have some understanding of what was common practice in ancient Greco-Roman society or even ancient Jewish
Mm-hmm.
society too,
Yeah, yeah.
this notion of heir implies
Mm,
inheritance.
yeah, that's right.
And so then we get into this great discussion of, okay, how does family stuff get passed on, right? Well,
Yeah,
sons typically inherited, daughters were
right.
typically married, and then there was an economic exchange at the time of their marriage,
Yeah, yeah,
typically. And so they didn't inherit because, well, that economic exchange had already happened, but the son's
yeah,
inheritance was generally kind of the prime stuff.
right.
And so to
Oh,
talk about inheritance like
that's good.
this and to
Mm-hmm,
connect that with women, oh
mm-hmm.
man, this is earth shattering stuff.
That's really good. I'm glad you brought that out. I was thinking, that's powerful. I'm encouraged by that. The language of inheritance shows up in chapter 1 when he talks about um being in this new family, God, as the parent, and we are now inheritance that's laid up in heaven for us, and all of that kind of language. But you make a really good point that there's something um uh atypical, right? Not like the rest of society to talk about women as inheritors. Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
A blind squirrel finds a nut every now and then.
That was really good. I like that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hmm.
Let me ask,
Hmm.
what is some unique contribution
Yeah.
that First Peter makes to the New Testament? And if there are one or two that really strike you, we've got time to talk about those too.
All right. Well, I'll mention briefly. I think one of the things that is unique is even this emphasis on suffering we're talking about. Because when we look at like a lot of Pauline letters, suffering might be in the background, or we might think of Paul suffering for the faith because of the risk he took to be an evangelist and to
Mm,
travel. But we often think of the community dealing with internal issues that have to be corrected. Like in First, Second Corinthians, and maybe even Colossians, that there's some philosophy that's creeping in and they have to
sure.
straighten it out. But here it's one of the unique contributions of First Peter is that there very much is the internal external tension, right? There's the outside world and how they view. So it's giving us a glimpse into how Roman society may have viewed these Christians, right? And that it wasn't just they were off in the corner doing something by themselves, but they were running into conflict with the rest. So I think that is a somewhat unique contribution of First Peter to highlight the conflict that was emerging between Christians and the broader society.
Yeah.
The other thing, and maybe there's a bunch of them, but the other thing that came to my mind right away was the weird, I'd say weird because it's a confusing passage in chapter 3.
Oh, I was hoping you're going to go there. I was hoping you were going to go there.
I was afraid you were going to ask me about it. But that whatever is going on there, it's given us this sense that something was happening, even post Good Friday, and maybe pre Easter, at least part of Easter that we know, which is the empty tomb. That something's going on there, and it's a difficult passage. I'm not going to lie, and there's a lot of debate over what's going on there. But I think that's one of the unique contributions, is that something happened when Jesus rose from the dead that wasn't as obvious that we read about at the end of the Gospels. The obvious thing of meaning he physically appeared and met with the disciples. There's something actually else going on in a world unseen to us. So Peter makes a contribution in there that's really unique in the New Testament.
For folks who are curious, what part of chapter 3 are you talking about? Well, chapter 3, 18. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 and following.
You're right. I didn't specify, but it's right.
That's okay.
All the way to the end. Yep.
That's all right. Yeah. I just knew if we didn't bring this up, I was going to get roasted by somebody. I can't believe you had this guy on and you didn't ask him about 1 Peter 3. No. I think you're right. This is strange. Like whatever perspective you take on it.
Yeah.
This is a strange passage. And essentially, like you said, between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, something happens.
Something happens.
And we could leave it at that. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. Well, I'll say a little bit more. I mean,
please do.
There's a lot going on. I mean, the basic issue is there's some folks who say, okay, Jesus went, quote unquote, went to hell for us. I've heard many evangelistic messages like that. I've heard people do that, for the youth group, that Jesus loved you so much, he went to hell for you. So the idea that Jesus went to the same place as any other dead person. But sometimes if we say hell, we think of that as a place of punishment. So like, wait, what do you mean by saying Jesus went to hell? So that's part of the issue. There's where did Jesus go? And are we talking about him going there? And then what did he do there? Right. Yeah. So for some people, okay, he preached to people, so he gave them a chance to hear the good news and respond. Or it was people who had died way back, some would say in the days of Noah. So there's that. All of that. It's like, where did he go and who he's talking to, right?
Yeah.
But I would say the NIV translation is actually it took some liberties, but it might be helpful at the end of verse 18. It says, he was put to death in the body, made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went, made proclamation. So they have said, oh, wait a second. That's early Sunday morning. This is not about Saturday, right? Because if he's made alive, right? Yeah. So the question is, right, when, right? Made alive, and then made proclamation. That doesn't necessarily mean an evangelistic speech. And who is he talking to? It says imprisoned spirits.
Yeah.
So there are some who would argue that we're really talking about a very unique group. And I'll just put it simply: imprisoned spirits would be rebellious, celestial beings.
Yeah.
And Jesus proclaims victory to them. And so that's what some would argue is happening here, that the proclamation is that, I just defeated death in the grave, and pronounce victory over the evil one. So that might be happening there. So it's not about dead people. It might be imprisoned spirits, meaning celestial beings, or let's say demonic beings, or some entity like that. But all that to say is that there's drama in the other world, right? It's a drama that's not happening on earth per se, but it's happening in the spirit realm that Peter gets at. And he says it like, whoa, this just adds to his argument about what Jesus did for us.
Yeah. I had not previously connected these verses with Ephesians chapter 2, but all this discussion that Paul has about how we were living according to these rulers and principalities and things along those lines.
Yes.
I believe that there is overlap between that collection of spirits and powers that Paul mentions in Ephesians 2, with perhaps at least with some of these imprisoned spirits
That may
that First Peter 3 might mention.
there may be, and I think that that's a reality that more and more scholars are paying attention to. This whole notion of the spiritual conflict that Jesus wins, but
Mhm.
that is a reality that affects human beings.
Yeah.
So for Christ to have one, I mean, the victory, I think it comes clear because at the
Very
end it
true.
says
Yeah.
he's gone into the right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in
Mhm.
submission to him. And that's the same language you get in Paul, right? The
Yeah.
authorities and powers in
Mhm.
submission to him. So yeah, I do think there's overlap there with Ephesians and even Colossians. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that section there, because that had you not mentioned that, I was gonna have to bring that up.
Well, I get nervous about it because there's so many thoughts and it's hard to explain because it's convoluted. I mean, even the
Mhm.
days of Noah, then you got the baptism imagery. I mean, there's so much that's going on there that it's hard to explain in a short amount of time. But my encouragement though is to say there's something happening that Jesus is defeating, right?
Mhm.
There's a victory story that's going
Yeah.
on here, and it's happening in a spiritual realm.
Yeah. I think I had not ever encountered this verse in my days growing up in church.
Mm.
And so like when I got to seminary in that exegesis class on First Peter, and we got to this, I at least had the advantage of not having had years to become entrenched in my perspective on this.
Mm.
And so I feel like maybe by God's grace, I was able to hear, the top 2 or 3 options.
Yeah.
All at the same time, and without emotional attachment, kind of weigh which ones I thought made the most sense.
Yeah.
The way that I read this, I think, is the way how you presented it. That
Yeah.
Setting aside precise chronology, right, of when Jesus dies
Mhm.
and when this particular proclamation happens.
Right.
If I understood you correctly, I think we're on the same page here.
Mhm.
Jesus proclaims victory. Probably doesn't go to preach, hey, whosoever will come, right? It's not an
Right.
invitation.
Right.
He's proclaiming victory
Yeah.
over these imprisoned spirits.
Yes.
And then that is explicitly spelled out in verse 22.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chapter 3, verse 22 there,
That's
where
right. Yeah.
all these things. And so at the
That's right.
bottom line, what we can say then is, again, if
Mhm.
I'm understanding you correctly, is
Mhm.
there's a proclamation of victory.
Mhm.
And by sharing in Christ's suffering, you will also share in that victory.
I think that'll preach. I think that'll preach, man.
Yes,
That's
sir.
good. That's
Yes,
good.
sir.
I'm with you on that.
All right. Last thing I wanted to ask about, and
Sure.
then I'll open it up if there's anything else you thought about.
Okay.
What is maybe a favorite verse of yours, a verse or a collection of verses from First Peter?
That is really hard. It's like, oh my goodness. I'll say this. I've preached a great deal from chapter 4 and it's 7 to 11. I preach that because it's this really nice, hopeful passage that he says, the end of all things is near. He says there's something hopeful, even though that could be ominous sounding. When you're struggling, that's good news, that the end is coming. There's something better on the horizon. But in the meantime, you nurture your horizontal life. You're sober and alert so you can pray. And then you nurture this I said that was vertical life that you can pray, and your horizontal life is characterized by love. You love each other deeply. So I used to teach math, and I would say that's life on the hypotenuse of a right triangle. You've got this part, and then you got the part that connects the vertical and the horizontal. They call that the hypotenuse. And that's what Christians do. We live in that space where we are nurturing a relationship with God and a relationship with other people. And it's not one extreme or the other. We're balancing, we're kind of continuing to make that connection. So I like that passage. And then he elaborates on, how do you do this? You pray. That's how you nurture your vertical relationship with God. And love characterizes the horizontal, and love plays itself out in forgiveness, covers a multitude of sin, plays itself out in service. So I preach that passage a lot. It's one of my favorites. I think right behind it would be chapter 5 with the emphasis on humility among the community. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Dr. Edwards, this has been a lot of fun. Is there anything else that you would want to mention right here at the end of all things as we wrap up? Anything else that you maybe thought of, or something else you want to return to just real quick?
It's kind that you asked me that. I really appreciate it. I won't beat a dead horse, but something that came up earlier in our conversation, you mentioned Dr. Keener's work, conversation about in Revelation about Babylon. And about this notion of, getting into the world systems and stuff. That might have been just the conversation you and I are having before we got recorded. But Peter, at the end, he talks about Babylon, and he says,
there's a mysterious reference to
this
Babylon for some reason.
And I bring that up because it seems like he's in Rome and he's making reference to Rome as Babylon. But I'm saying, if Peter's doing that, and the writer John of Revelation is doing that, there's something that Babylon symbolizes that is that the Christians might have gotten right early on, that to use that old city of Babylon as a image, as a cipher for Rome of some sort, that should capture our imagination. Something about the way the empire is working. And Peter's there, he's in the midst of it, he's greeting you from there. But I find that just kind of interesting that he doesn't say I'm in Rome or the church is in Rome, but she who is in Babylon. It's kind of cryptic, but it sounds like, here's this church that's right here in the midst of the empire, but we're greeting you, and encouraging you out there in Turkey. So I don't know, that just strikes me at the very end.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably not hard to guess what my libertarian friends would think about that, but well, that is it is interesting. And when you think about Babylon, you can almost say that, I don't know, there seemed like there's some kind of a mixed reception of Babylon. I mean, you have guys like Daniel Daniel isn't tanking Babylon's bureaucracy.
No,
he's not an inside man. He's not a mole. I mean, things are operating smoothly. And then when you get to Revelation, Babylon is this horrific satanic monster. And it's fascinating to see how both are affirmed in scripture, uncomfortably so for folks who are trying to figure out maybe who they need to vote for.
well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I do think, I mean, I'm with you on that. There is some ambiguity, but Babylon, either way, I mean, wherever you come to the conclusion, Babylon is not the one that sets the agenda, though, because even for Daniel, he doesn't tank Babylon, but he's not really of Babylon. He's in it, but he's not of it. And so he's still marching to a different drumbeat. So I think that's important for us.
All right, Dr. Edwards, this was a delight. I am glad to make your acquaintance. Hopefully we'll be able to run into each other again, maybe collaborate on some other projects in the future. Thank you so much, sir.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it.
All right, take care.
Thanks.